Hey, I'm Big Chrisley, and welcome back to Evergreen Perspective. Today, we're asking a question that's become more than just a meme. It's a reality check for millions of Americans. Is 9 to 5 job still enough to survive, let alone thrive? We're talking about the rise of side hustles, the gig economy, and the explosion of freelancing and independent work. But we're also talking about risk, about what happens when stable jobs don't pay the bills and workers are pushed into chasing multiple income streams just to make ends meet. And we're going to ground that right here in Washington State, right? From the freelance folks up in Seattle to the delivery drivers here in Vancouver. We're going to be talking about those working from home, trying to make extra cash. But let's rewind for a minute. I think it's important to rewind for a minute. There was a time in America not that long ago. It wasn't that long ago, guys, when a single income could support an entire household. One full-time job. That was a deal. It came with a wage you could live on. You had health insurance, a pension, a possibility of buying a home, maybe saving some money for your kids' future. I mean, that was the promise. That's the promise we were made. That's the promise we were made. If you worked hard, played by the rules, you would be taken care of, right? And for a while, it worked, at least for some. After World War II, Americans' wages soared and kept up with productivity. The middle class exploded in the 50s and 60s, right? Many jobs, factories, offices, public services roles allowed families to live a modest and stable life. But if you fast forward to today, that system is completely unraveled. Real wages have barely moved since the 1970s when you adjust for inflation. While the cost of everything else skyrocketed, housing, education, healthcare, childcare, right? A college degree no longer guarantees any type of financial stability. And working full time, it's not nearly enough for most Americans. So let's take the story of a social worker right here in Vancouver, right? She got a college degree. You have to have a college degree to be a social worker. We all know they're not the highest paying jobs. She spends her days helping the most vulnerable families navigate housing insecurity, addiction. You know, her job is essential, right? It's socially critical, and yet her 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 wages barely cover her rent. So she has to DoorDash in the evenings and the weekends, not because it's fun for her, but because she needs that cash in order to afford the rising cost of living here in Clark County. And she's not the exception. She's the rule. Administrative professionals, office workers, healthcare assistants, the very people who keep our communities running are left behind by an economy that no longer honors their labor with dignity or fair pay. So let's talk numbers. But before we do that, let's bring in Kate for Kate's Civic Corner.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, folks. Kate here with the Civic Corner, taking a minute to highlight some opportunities to get involved here in Southwest Washington. If you don't live in this area, get online and search around a bit. I'm confident you'll find events and opportunities near you. You can find more information on each of the events we're highlighting today using the links we've put in the show notes. Coming up on June 18th, we have the Clark County Council meeting starting at 6 p.m. at the Public Service Center in Vancouver. This can also be attended virtually. On June 24th, the Cowlitz County Republican Central Committee will be holding their meeting in Kelso beginning at 6:30 p.m. And on June 25th, the 20th Legislative District Democrats will be holding their monthly meeting at 7 p.m. via Zoom. Now on to our featured volunteer program of the week. The Washington Gorge Action Programs is an organization that helps folks working through a variety of struggles, including homelessness, food scarcity, challenges using social services, and domestic violence. These are just a few of the struggles they seek to alleviate. As they say on their website, if you've ever asked yourself, how can I help? They have your answer. Again, check the links in the show notes for more information on each of these events and organizations. That's it for Kate's Civic Corner. If there's an event in Southwest Washington that you'd like us to feature here on Evergreen Perspective, please put a note in the comments or send us an email. This is Kate, encouraging you to get out there and get involved. Now back to Ben.
Thanks, Kate. Let's get into those numbers I just talked about. Here in Washington, we have one of the highest minimum wages in the country. And that didn't happen by accident. It happened because voters pushed for it. Washingtonians pushed for it. In 1998, Washington became the first state to automatically tie its minimum wage to inflation. That's a no-brainer. That helped protect workers, right, from falling behind the cost of living too much. In 2016, voters passed Initiative 1433, raising the minimum wage step up to $13.50 by 2020 and expanding paid sick leave rights. Today, in 2025, Washington's minimum wage is $16.28 per hour. That's nearly double the federal minimum wage of $7.25, which, by the way, hasn't moved since 2009. But every time there's talk about raising wages, whether it's at the state level or nationally, the same fear-mongering starts, right? The same argument surface. Prices will go up. Small businesses will close. It'll hurt the economy. Let's call that what it is, a myth. A myth carefully crafted and repeated by billionaires, Wall Street, lobbyists, and corporate think tanks who've spent decades convincing working Americans that we can't afford to pay people enough to live. Meanwhile, their profits have never looked better. Record profits for these companies. They say raising wages causes inflation. But what's really driving prices, it's not workers demanding a fair paycheck. It's corporate greed. We've seen it over and over. Companies raising prices well beyond their increased costs just to deliver better than expected earnings and keep investors happy. In other words, it's not just about survival. It's about satisfying the shareholders. It's about putting money ahead of people. That's the dirty little secret of our economy. It's designed not to reward the worker, but to reward the shareholder. And who owns those shares? Roughly 10% of Americans. 10% own over 90%. So when companies cut corners, hold wages down, and pocket the difference, it's not going to your neighbor. It's going to the wealthiest households in America. And they're doing just fine. So now imagine that in reverse. What if more people earned enough to thrive? More disposable income means more money spent locally, right? At grocery stores, retailers, small businesses, hair salons, etc., right? It means parents could afford childcare without having to max out a credit card. It means fewer people needing public assistance just to get by. That's how you build a strong economy. From the middle out, not the top down. That doesn't work. Never has. Never will. But the ultra-wealthy don't want that, right? Because if working people start demanding more, they stop buying into the lie that higher wages ruin everything, then the entire structure gets exposed, right? All the exploitation comes out, right? They're loving this division we got right now. They're thrilled when working class is fighting itself, arguing over whether a fast food worker deserves $20 an hour or not, whether gig drivers should get health insurance, while billionaires pass massive tax cuts, right out there for us to see. I mean, they're not even hiding it. They're not even hiding the tax cuts they're giving themselves. We're still fighting amongst ourselves while they laugh all the way to the bank with our money. Just look at what happened a couple weeks ago, right? The House passed a bill that once again hands tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans and slashes programs for the working class. Money out of schools, cuts to nutrition programs, stripping back job training, Medicaid, Medicare, all while the richest Americans get even more help they don't need. And it's wrapped in this baloney message of fiscal responsibility. What a load of crap, right? Well, the truth is, this is going to add trillions of dollars to this deficit they claim to care so much about, right? But more than any of that, it's going to devastate the American people. The hard-working American people are going to lose their health care, right, to their most vulnerable Americans. This isn't hyperbole. This is fact. Where's the responsibility when CEOs make 400 times more than their employees? Where's the responsibility when corporations post record profits and still lay people off? Where's the responsibility when they're paying their workers poverty wages while they fly private and the American people picks up their benefits? In 2024, corporations brought in a record-breaking $3.8 trillion in profit. We're talking about profits, guys. We're not talking about revenue. We're talking about profit. And yet we're still told They can't afford to raise wages and pay living wages. That somehow paying these living wages would break the system, raise prices, or tank the economy. It's a lie. And one that benefits exactly the people writing the checks and collecting record profits. Meanwhile, the average CEO of a Fortune 500 company made $17.5 million apiece last year. That's over 400 times more than the average American worker. 400 times. Let's do the math. If a CEO makes $17.5 million and the average worker for their company makes, let's say, $59,000, which is the median income according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, that means that one CEO earns almost as much in a single day as that worker earns in an entire year. And we're supposed to believe that's deserved, that one person's labor or their decision making or their vision is worth hundreds of times more than the people actually doing the work? Come on. You can't really believe that. That's not leadership. That's exploitation. That's exploiting the hard-working American worker. Corporations can absolutely afford to pay workers more, right? Most of them have chosen instead to hoard profits, right? Boost their stock prices, buy back stock shares, all right? Inflated CEO bonuses, because that's what Wall Street rewards. I'll remind you once again that 90% of the stocks are owned by 10% of the people. That's all they care about. And they've done it while lobbying against minimum wage increases, against union protections, against paid sick leave. All while turning around and posting quarterly record profits quarter after quarter. These companies can afford golden parachutes, private jets, and luxury retreats for their executives, then they can afford to pay their workers enough so that they can pay their rent and raise a family and retire with some dignity. You don't have to be anti-business to say that, right? You just got to be pro-people. You got to be for people. You just have to believe in fairness. Workers aren't asking for yachts. We're just trying to pay our groceries, right? Trying to keep a roof over our head, right? It's time that we stop accepting excuses from these most profitable companies, right? And start demanding an economy where success is shared, not just stockpiled at the top. And the truth is, not paying people enough is the reason we're so divided right now as a country. People are angry. People are exhausted. They're turning on each other because they've been convinced that the fight is sideways between middle class and working class neighbors, instead of where the power really sits, up top, where they're hoarding all those record profits. Right? This isn't about some jealousy, it's about justice. Because if you work full time, especially in a state like Washington, with one of the highest cost of living, you should be able to pay your bills, take a day off when you're sick, and live with some damn dignity. Right? And the people fighting hardest against that, right, aren't the ones clocking in at 6 a.m. They're the ones cashing in on our division, right? Lobbying Congress to keep things just the way it is because they don't want to hurt their record profits. Because the hard truth is, even at $16.28 an hour, full-time wage, in Clark County, that gets you about $2,600 a month before taxes. Meanwhile, the average rent for a two-bedroom apartment is nearly $1,800. You had groceries, utilities, insurance, gas, childcare, and the math just doesn't math, right? Not without a second job, not without another side hustle. And that's why even well-educated full-time professionals are driving for Uber, selling on Etsy, or picking up weekend shifts at Target. Not to get rich, but because they're trying to make ends meet and stay afloat. Here's where it gets even more twisted, right? These billion-dollar corporations love this setup. They love it. They get all that productivity, all the labor, all the availability with none of the responsibility. If you're part-time or a contractor, they don't have to pay for your health care. They don't have to offer any retirement match, no sick leave, no paid vacation, right? No unemployment insurance, no HR problems. Easy peasy for them. They just get your labor on demand for the cheap. That's why companies from Amazon and Walmart to DoorDash invest millions and millions every year to lobby to keep wages low and protections weak. They want a desperate workforce, one willing to hustle harder, take more risk, and accept less security. Because that's good for their bottom line, right? They like to call it some sense of flexibility. But flexibility only benefits the workers when there's power in the relationship. Most of the time, that flexibility is just code for, hey, you're on your own. Good luck. They know that if people are hungry enough, tired enough, stretched thin enough, they won't push back. They'll take what they get because they can't afford not to. And when someone tries to raise minimum wage or pass laws to give gig workers benefits or rights, these same companies flood the airwaves and the Capitol step with lobbyists saying it'll hurt jobs, it'll raise prices. But that's not the truth. The truth is it just cuts into their record profits. That's all it does. Nothing more. Nothing more. Let's not forget Amazon made over $30 billion in profit last year. That's profit. $30 billion in profit. Right? Meanwhile, DoorDash drivers, on the other hand, make as little as $2 to $3 per delivery. Right? And that whole no tax on tips thing, that won't help these gig workers because it only counts on cash tips, which you're not getting on these apps. Right? This isn't an accident. This is what happens when corporate profit is prioritized over human dignity. When political systems are shaped not by the people doing the work, but by the people cashing in on it. And right here in Washington, the same battles are playing out. Right? From failed union drives to legislative roadblocks around classifying gig workers as employees. This isn't just national news. It's happening right here in Olympia. It's happening right here in our neighborhoods. So if you're wondering why so many people are working harder than ever and falling further behind, look no further than the system that was designed to do exactly that. It's the way the system was designed. This isn't just about personal budgeting, right? It's a sign that the promise of the American dream, the idea that if you work hard, right, it's going to lead to a better life. That's broken for many, for most. And in places like here in Southwest Washington, where families are trying to raise kids, build businesses, and invest in the future, that disconnect between effort and reward, is hitting especially hard. So what do people do when one job doesn't cut it anymore? We got to hustle, right? They got to try to survive however they can. That's how we got here. A place where millions of Americans are driving for Uber, delivering for DoorDash, freelancing online, flipping furniture, selling crafts, walking dogs, taking surveys for pocket change, whatever they can do, right? Welcome to Side Hustle Nation, where the American dream is dying. It's not a niche anymore. It's the norm. More than 1 in 3 U.S. workers are now part of the gig economy, right? In some form or another, right? Right here in Washington, from college student, in Camas doing graphic design to stay-at-home parent in Ridgefield trying to sell homemade soap on Etsy's, even retirees, picking up Amazon Flex shifts to cover healthcare premiums. And sure, some people love the freedom, right? They like being their own boss, setting their own hours, monetizing a skill or passion. That part can be empowering when you're in control. But let's not confuse freedom with survival mode. Because for many, maybe most, side hustles aren't really a choice. They've become a necessity to make ends meet. Talking about people who already have a job or two and still can't make rent. People using every spare minute outside their primary job just to patch the holes in their budget. That's not freedom, right? That's economic desperation, right? Disguised as some form of entrepreneurship. And Washington's policies, while progressive in some areas, still haven't fully caught up. Let's take gig workers. In most cases, they're still classified as independent contractors, which means no health insurance from the company they're working for. So like Uber, Lyft, etc. No unemployment benefits if they lose access to work. Recent legislation now guarantees gig workers minimum compensation with some paid sick leave and paid family and medical leave. But make no mistake, those companies fought at every turn, pushing back hard against these steps forward to make these workers have more dignity. But let's be crystal clear, because this is where it kind of gets twisted. We're not talking about your local coffee shop trying to stay afloat. We're not talking about the mom and pop hardware store or the family restaurant out in Washougal. We're talking about billion-dollar companies like DoorDash and Uber, Instacart, that are deliberately exploiting legal loopholes to squeeze more out of workers while dodging their basic responsibilities of being an employer. They've built entire business models around offloading risk onto the individual. Right? They don't pay into workers' comp. They don't contribute their share of Social Security or Medicare for these workers. They don't offer insurance, vacation, or retirement plans. They provide an app, and the worker provides everything else: the car, the phone, the fuel, the liability, the labor. And then when that worker gets sick, gets hurt, or their car breaks down, they're on their own. No support. There's no fallback there, right? Just an algorithm and a 5-star rating that determines whether they get their next paycheck. And when policymakers have tried to change that, try to classify these workers as employees or give them a living wage, these corporations turn around and respond with lawsuits, lobbying, and scare tactics. They claim that any change would hurt innovation or raise cost, when in reality, the only thing it threatens is their obscene profit margins. Right? Because let's be honest, these companies aren't barely scraping by. They're sitting on billions. Right? They're handing out executive bonuses and stock options while arguing that people doing the actual work, the deliveries, the rides, the services, are somehow too expensive to support with basic needs and benefits. Let's pause here for a second, because this is where it gets complicated. We talked about it. Not every business is built the same. Small family-owned businesses, like the ones you'll find all over Clark County, they're not operating with billion-dollar profit margins. They're not hoarding stock buybacks or paying their CEOs millions in bonuses. They're scraping by to make payroll. Right? They're trying to provide for their employees and serve our community. So yes, raising wages and strengthening worker protections, it's got to be done very thoughtfully. And that's the dilemma we face, right? How do we protect small businesses while holding these giant corporations accountable? How do we build an economy where work pays enough to live on without driving local shops and services out of business? We're going to dig into some of those solutions later in the episode. But it starts with basic policy, right? That recognizes the difference between a hedge fund-owned chain and your neighborhood hardware store, between a tech platform making billions from gig labor and a Main Street cafe just trying to get by. Right now, that system doesn't make that distinction. Too often, it puts a large burden on small business owners while letting the giant corporations off the hook, lets them write their own rules. This isn't about keeping small businesses afloat. It's about keeping corporate shareholders fat and happy while everyday workers are bled dry. And it's happening right here in Washington. Even in a state with some of the strongest worker protections in the country, gig workers remain in a gray zone without the rights, the stability, or the dignity they deserve. In 2022, Seattle passed a law giving app-based delivery drivers some basic rights: minimum per trip, rest breaks, sick leave. And what happened? The corporations pushed back, obviously, right? Some of them simply stopped offering certain services in the city altogether. A little corporate tantrum because they were asked to treat workers like real people. And the rest of Washington, those protections don't exist. Even as the gig economy expands, our legal protections haven't kept up. All right, and while the state proudly promotes entrepreneurship with startup incubators, tax incentives, and even grant programs, the average solo freelancer or craft seller or digital laborer is still left navigating an unforgiving system with little to no safety net. Right? And it's not just delivery apps and online gigs. All right, we touched on it a little bit earlier. Even traditional companies are leaning into this model. Right? They're moving towards hiring more part-time people, temporary workers, contract workers, so they can avoid offering or paying any of these benefits. Right? It's cost cutting disguised as some type of flexibility. And the result is a workforce that is continually underprotected, underpaid, and overworked. Right? let's be clear. People aren't lazy, right? They're exhausted. If you ever worked a full shift only to come home and spend your evening gigging, right, or hustling just to stay above water, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And this isn't just about money. It's about time, right? That's time you could have been spending with your kids, your partner, your community. Time for you to rest, right? As a human. That's what the side hustle economy steals most. It's our time, right? Eventually our health and our sense of inner peace, right? So now some folks here all, think this, right? They think, okay, I get it. Maybe working for somebody else, isn't working. So why not just go independent? And that's a fair question. I mean, that's the American dream right there, right? The idea of working for yourself is appealing, right? No boss, no time clock, no dress code, just you, your skills, and your hustle. That is the modern American dream, right? The rise of the entrepreneur. But beneath the Instagram gloss and motivational slogans, there's a hard truth. Self-employment, today's economy, is a high wire act with no safety net. Let's take the story of a HVAC technician in Vancouver. After years of working for somebody else, he finally struck out on his own, started his own business, took on the risk, built up a small client base, and slowly began to grow. But then reality sets in, right? You got health insurance, nearly $800 a month for a family plan on the Washington Exchange, right? Time off, non-existent. If he's not working, he's not earning, right? And then you got accounting, marketing, liability insurance, taxes, all on him. And in Washington, the business and occupation tax gets collected on gross receipts, not profit, right? Which means if he's barely breaks even after expenses, he still owes taxes on the full amount of his gross receipts. And when a slow season hits or a major client pulls out, there's no unemployment insurance to fall back on. There's no HR department, no paid sick days, just a pile of bills and the pressure to keep grinding. I don't think that's freedom. That's a gamble. And for too many Washingtonians, especially those in the trades, arts, or solo service professions, it's a gamble, and a lot of them are losing. A lot of them. Even in this state that prides itself on innovation and entrepreneurship. Right? The systems in place favor big business, not the little guy. Right? Corporate-backed franchises can afford legal teams and accountants to navigate the complexity of self-employment. They can negotiate bulk healthcare rates, absorb off-seasons, they can write off equipment, but the solo graphic designer out in Washougal, or the mobile dog groomer up in Orchards, right, or the handyman out in Salmon Creek, they're eating every cost and still trying to compete with these large corporations. And here's the deeper issue, because so many people are forced into self-employment just to survive, not because they wanted to be entrepreneurs, but because there were no good paying jobs available. All right, we've blurred the lines between independence and isolation. There's no retirement plan. There's no HR protection, no guaranteed wage. When those people fall behind, they're often blamed for not managing their business properly, as if the game wasn't rigged from the start. Right? Worst, it can trap people in a cycle of financial instability. If you have a few bad months, you fall behind on your bills, right? Your credit score drops. That makes it harder for you to get a loan or to get money. You lose access to that capital, which makes it even harder for you to scale your business. And so the spiral continues. This is especially brutal for people of color or those limited generational wealth who often turn to self-employment because they've been shut out of traditional employment opportunities to begin with. Right? And it's important to say, Washington could be doing more. We've seen creative programs like the Working Families Tax Credit, right, and small business grants during COVID. But where's the long-term investment in solo entrepreneurs? Where's the affordable group healthcare model for self-employed workers? Where's the retirement bridge for gig workers who pay self-employment tax but get none of the perks? Right? Right now, we're building a system that celebrates a self-starter, but then punishes them once they actually get started. Unless we rethink that system, unless we build one that actually supports people who take that risk, the dream of self-employment will remain exactly that, a dream, and not a viable path for most working people. So let's take a step back, all right? Because everything we've talked about so far, talked about the falling value of full-time work, the rise of the side hustle, the high risk of self-employment, right? All points to the much bigger question, and is the American dream still real? You know the version we've been sold, right? Work hard, play by the rules, get an education, land a steady job, buy a home, raise a family, maybe retire, if you do everything right. But here in 2025, that dream is looking more and more like a fantasy for working and middle class Americans. Right? Let me tell you about a couple I met in east side of Vancouver here. Both of them are college educated, both working full time. She's a project coordinator for a local construction firm. He's an assistant manager at a grocery store. No lavish spending, no vacations, no frivolous debt, and yet they can't afford to buy a home in the community they grew up in. Right? They're boxed out by sky-high prices, investor-owned properties, and stagnant wages that haven't kept up. Right? They've done everything right and still feel like they're falling behind. Right? And here in Clark County, they're far from alone. The median home price in Vancouver now hovers around $500,000. Rent is climbing faster than incomes. Student loans are draining bank accounts. And the cost of childcare, that's if you can even find a spot for childcare, rivals a second mortgage for most. The gap between what we were promised and what we're living is massive. And people feel it. We're starting to feel it in the community. That's why there's so much frustration right now, so much fatigue. Not because people don't want to work, but because they're working harder than ever and still can't afford basic stability. Because they feel like the system is rigged and nobody's listening. And let's be honest, they're not wrong. Right? Let's look at the numbers. Right? If you've listened to this podcast, we've talked about this before. Since the 1970s, worker productivity has skyrocketed, but wages have barely budged. And let's talk about that productivity for a minute. Because this is part where defenders of the status quo like to say, well, of course corporations are making more money now. Look at all the advances in technology. Look at the automation, software, the robotics. That's where the profit is coming from. Okay, sure. Technology has changed the game. It's made things faster, right? It's made things more efficient. Supply chains move quicker. Customer service is more streamlined, right? Data is now instantaneous. But here's the part they always leave out. Workers are the ones who adapted. They learned new systems. They dealt with those disruptions. They handled higher workloads with fewer coworkers. They're the ones who've been stretched thin and told, do more with less. And it's been going on for decades, while executive pay has soared and real wages for the real working class is flatlined. Since the 1970s, worker productivity in the U.S. has more than doubled, but wages barely moved when adjusted for inflation. It's not because the money disappeared. It's because it went somewhere else. Where'd it go? To the top. To corporate profits, to Wall Street, to the shareholders, to the CEOs, not to the hard-working Americans doing the work. Here's the deal. If a company is making record profits because of productivity gains, then the workers who help make that productivity possible deserve a share of those profits as well. Not just like a pizza party with a thank you, but real compensation, real wages, real dignity. Technology didn't replace the worker. Made the worker more valuable, just less empowered, though. And the corporations love this imbalance because as long as the public keeps believing that robots did it, they don't have to face the truth. Profits came from squeezing more out of the same people for less pay. And I'm not trying to be anti-tech. I'm trying to be pro-worker, because progress doesn't have to mean exploitation, right? Doesn't have to mean. This isn't just a financial crisis, it's a psychological one too. Because when people stop believing that hard work pays off, the entire foundation of democracy starts to shake. And right now it's shaking. Make no mistake about it. Right? We have resentment, division, distrust, which is currently at an all-time high. People are turning on one another instead of turning toward the real problem. A system that rewards wealth over work, rewards profit over people. And the ultra-wealthy, billionaires, they're counting on that. They're counting on us to continue to fight about, amongst ourselves. Who's lazy? Who's entitled? Who deserves help? Meanwhile, they're just going to collect these tax breaks. They're going to keep hoarding up the money. They're going to keep buying up the real estate, right? But the American dream doesn't have to die, right? We have to make it evolve. We have to stop measuring success by outdated standards, for starters, right? Homeownership isn't the only path to dignity. A four-year degree isn't the only measure of worth, right? Stability, community health, and time, those should be a part of our American dream, too. If we want that dream to be real again for our kids, for us, our neighbors, for everyone in Southwest Washington, we need policies that match the reality people are living in today, not the fantasy world of 50 years ago. That means we need to have fair wages, affordable housing, debt relief, healthcare that isn't tied to a job, and a system that values hard work and labor, not just capital. Because the dream isn't gone. It's just waiting to be reclaimed for all of us to get together and move towards the same goal. All right, so what do? We've laid out the problem, right? We've done that. We know wages are stuck. Costs are up. One job isn't enough. The gig economy is booming. But not because people are thriving. It's because the traditional safety net has huge gaping holes in it, right? And billion-dollar companies are profiting from every drop of our labor. And now we're at a crossroads, right? Because the American dream doesn't have to be dead. It doesn't. But it does need a serious update, and one that fits the economy we actually live in, not just the one we wish we still had. Let's start with what we can control. Right here in Washington State, right? We got to raise the floor. But we got to scale that support with it. We can raise wages and improve worker protections without crushing small businesses. It's entirely possible. The key is smart policy design, right? Instead of, using only employee count, let's also classify businesses by gross revenue. So we know who's truly small and who just looks small on paper, right? Let's raise the minimum wage with carve-outs or offsets that help local mom-and-pop businesses stay competitive, right? Not just push the cost or the burden onto these small businesses. Right? Let's unburden these small employers by offering a state-managed healthcare option so they don't have to shoulder the cost of private insurance, which, too often forces them to cut wages or cut hours or eventually go out of business. All right? Meanwhile, we need stricter regulations on big corporations, especially those that deliberately misclassify employees and dodge their taxes or rely on underpaid contract or gig workers to inflate their profits. Because fairness doesn't mean letting anyone off the hook. It means building a system where the real weight lands where it belongs. Right? Fair wages should be a shared responsibility, not a competitive disadvantage. Right? We also need to support the self-employed and the side hustlers. Right? If we're going to, keep celebrating entrepreneurship, we need to build a modern safety net for modern workers. Right? Create a statewide portable benefit system, right? A fund where gig workers and self-employed people can contribute with matching from platform companies, right? They need a match just like a real job, right? To get access to health care, paid leave, and retirement savings, right? Expand access to low-cost business loans and legal help for small businesses, right? Eliminate predatory lending to small businesses. It's the downfall of many. We got to eliminate those. We need to adjust the B&O tax structure so that sole proprietors aren't penalized for simply staying afloat. That means a family-run mechanic shop in Vancouver pays the same B&O rate as a multinational chain. It's time for a more progressive B&O tax structure, one that protects local businesses and sole proprietors while making sure the biggest players pay their fair share. That's not anti-business. That's pro-fairness, pro-community, pro-growth. Because when small businesses thrive, neighborhoods thrive, right? Our area thrives. And when billion-dollar companies profit off our state, they should help shoulder the load that keeps it all running. People shouldn't be punished for working for themselves, right? We got to give them more support. We need to decouple survival from employment, meaning healthcare, housing, and education should not be luxuries tied to the whims of your boss or the success of your side hustle, right? We need to expand Medicaid eligibility and increase funding for the Washington Health Plan Finder to improve access and affordability for all Washingtonians. We need to invest in workforce housing, especially in growing communities like Vancouver, East Clark County, right? So that people who serve our community can also afford to live where they work. We need to fund trade schools and apprenticeships at the same levels as universities, because not everyone needs a four-year degree, but everyone deserves a solid future, solid chance, right? We got to hold these corporations accountable. Let's stop pretending that Amazon and a family-owned bike shop are the same kind of business, right? We got to stop that. Got to require transparency on wage ratios. Maybe how much executives make compared to frontline workers, right? Perhaps we find a way to tie the lowest level line employee pay to the top line pay. Let's see what happens to pay then. Increase state level scrutiny of companies that skirt labor laws, right? Continue to use those contractor status to avoid employee obligations. You need to end corporate tax breaks unless the companies prove that they're actually creating good jobs with benefits and stability. No more rewarding companies for squeezing workers and offshoring their profits. Right? We need to invest in the community. We need to stop worshiping the stock market as if it's a measure of our nation's health. It's just not. Because the real economy, it's our grocery bill. It's your rent, your gas tank, your ability to get through the month without wondering if you're going to make it. If we truly want to bridge the divide in this country, economically, politically, socially, it starts by making sure that people aren't constantly in survival mode. And that's what this fight is really about. Because the billionaires and the politicians who carry the water for them, they want us distracted. They want working class people fighting over crumbs while they continue to feast and take advantage of us. But we don't have to accept that. Not in Clark County, not in Washington, not in the United States. And that's where we're going to leave it today. We've covered a lot. The rise of the gig economy, the squeeze on small businesses, the risk of being self-employed, the myth of the American dream, and the urgent need for smarter, fairer policies. Here's the bottom line. The problem isn't that people don't want to work. It's that too often the system doesn't reward that work fairly. We're living in a country where billion-dollar corporations post record profits, where CEOs pull in tens of millions, and yet tens of millions of workers are told, sorry, there's just no money left to pay better. We're told to hustle harder, stretch further, sacrifice more, just to survive. But it doesn't have to be that way, guys. We can build an economy where small businesses are supported, not suffocated. We can build an economy where workers get their fair share of the productivity they help create. Where opportunity isn't just reserved for the top 10%, but spreads across communities that actually keep this country running. Because at the end of the day, the American dream isn't about endless hustle. It's about having a fair shot. It's about having dignity, stability, and the chance to build something, not just for yourself, but for the next generation. I'm Ben Chrisley. This has been Evergreen Perspective. If today's episode sparked something in you, share it with a friend, start the conversation, because future of work and the future of fairness depends on all of us showing up and demanding better. We can do better, guys. Thanks for listening. As always, take care of yourself, take care of each other. I'll see you next time.